For survivors of attempted kidnapping, how did you escape? Guy at a club and his mix of friends was insistent about coming back to a party. I politely declined, didn't think much of it. They got increasingly aggressive about it, to a physical extent, and I left. Walking back home, I realized they were following me in their car, dashed down the road through the mid-path of a packed apartment complex and just started yelling like crazy. No one actually responded or poked their head out, or maybe they just didn't hear me, but it sparked the escape reflex of the creeps and I hid in a bush until my heart slowed down. Jumped the fence of someone's property, risky in its own right, wandered through a field, avoiding the main roads, and circled back to a side street to home. Lucky I knew the area better than they did. I don't know sure what this was, but I was riding my bike home alone, cutting through a deserted middle school and high school parking lots during the summertime. A man in a station wagon pulled up and offered me a ride home. I never stopped pedaling, just said no, I'm fine. He pressed several times saying he could fit my bike in his car. It was no big deal. I kept saying no. He gave up and left. Don't know if it was just a genuinely helpful guy. This was the late 70s or early 80s, so it wasn't yet completely extinct practice that strangers might offer each other rides, or a potential kidnapper. It was the 90s in SE Asia. I wasn't old enough to go to school yet, so my grandma took care of me while my parents were at work. My grandma had a little convenience store, and one day 2 men approached her. One was in his 30s and the other was an old short man with white hair. They were carrying those hand-weave basket pig cage. They asked my grandma if I was for sale. She told them to bugger off. While my grandma was distracted, they snatched me and I was carried away. I was kicking and screaming until they knocked me out. One of the neighbors saw me and alerted my grandma. My grandma rode her bicycle down the main street looking for me. She argued and threatened them to get me back. If it wasn't for my grandma and her stubborn fierceness, I wouldn't be here. She passed away in 2016. Love you and miss you, Grandma. My mom was always paranoid someone would kidnap us kids from the yard. We used to play outside while she worked from home. We were 10, 8 and 6 at this time. She paid our neighbor's teenage daughter to sit in the yard and watch us. Mostly she just ignored us and read a magazine with her headphones on and Walkman playing, but she was nice to us. I remember thinking this was stupid and mom was right there anyway, so why did I, basically a teenage, need to be babysat, lol. One day we were all up in our treehouse being jerks to our babysitter and unplugging her headset cord while she was trying to nap. A man and woman came into the yard via the side gate. They started talking to my youngest sibling, trying to get her to climb down. The babysitter screamed for help but no one came. She ended up throwing the ladder from the treehouse over our back fence into her own yard and made us all climb into her yard with her dog, who was going insane at the fence. We ended up locked in her house and she called the police. My mom didn't hear any of the commotion from inside the house and she won't speak about it even now that we are all adults. Never complained about my babysitter after that though. My wife told me that when she was just a teenager, she got in a cab and the cab driver just abducted her. He didn't take her to her destination. Instead, he took her to a hotel room. She was really scared, but she kind of started playing along a little and pretended that she was interested and into it. Then he lay down on the bed, and she said something like, "Oh, I'm hungry. Can we order a pizza first?" And the cab driver said okay. So she picked up the phone. While she was dialing, he wasn't paying attention, so she disconnected the cable. Then she said, "You know, I think the phone is broken. Let me go to the front desk to tell them, and I'll order the pizza while I'm there." So he says, "Okay, sure." She went to the front desk and told them what was happening. They called the cops. The cops came and hauled him away. If he doesn't pay attention while you dial, you can also call 911 and start talking to them like a pizza place. If you don't confirm it's not an emergency, they're obligated to check and see if you're okay. Was drugged at a small town bar. Went to the bartender and asked what drink she had given me. She recited what I had ordered. I told her I asked because I'm not feeling well suddenly, and it was like the world was spinning on its head. I sat at my seat because she said she hadn't seen anyone near my table/drink. Cool, whatever. It's getting worse and I'm feeling the worst I've ever felt in my life. I don't really remember what happened, but a guy had led me outside and we were getting in a car. I remember hearing bracelet and seeing handcuff clink on my tiny ass wrist. My first response was scream, kick, anything. I already felt like vomiting and pooping, so in my panic of scream and writhing around, drawing a lot of attention from a closed car apparently, I stopped for a second and hear finally, "You bitch," before I vomited all of the back seat. Myself. And I threw myself forward to cover him as well. At this point I had no control between vomiting and screaming as loud as could to vomit more. My drugged self was like, it can't get worse for me, and I literally pulled my pants down and shat as my body saw fit. Guy never left the parking lot because of the commotion I raised. I remember hearing people banging on the windows and the guy freaking out. So I started screaming help the best I could. The guy was arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping and drugging me with meth and fent that they found on his person. Blessed be the big man Mike, who carried my vomit poop cover self to the gym, next to the bar, where they let me shower and change. Oh my god. I'm kind of disappointed with the bartender. I would think if someone told them they were feeling dizzy, not feeling well, etc., Even if they didn't see anyone near their drink, they should have set you down at the bar and kept an eye on you till you got better. Glad you are safe.
When I was 8 years old, I had just moved to a new house that was directly across the street from the school I would be starting in just a month or two.
I would sometimes go to the school and play by myself for a bit. One time I was headed back home when I was approached and surrounded by a group of boys in their early teens. They told me to come hang out at their house. I shook my head and tried to run home but was blocked. The second oldest pulls out a $20 and tells me that I can have it once we get to their house. I think for a moment and decline again but am blocked again from leaving. My heart is racing and I keep looking longingly at my house. The boy with the money holds it out to me and says to take it and he'll give me another $20 at the house. It's in his wallet. He forgot it. The oldest chimes in telling me I would be able to buy a lot of candy with that money. I hesitate and start to reach my hand out to take the money and then see my chance to run between two of the boys and escape. They yelled and tried to grab me but I made it home. I saw some of them on occasion, but I always stayed far away and they seemed to have forgotten about me. I later learned that the house they were trying to take me to belonged to a drug-addicted mother who was rarely home and her sons just did whatever they wanted. I was 12 and some guy was walking towards me after school. He said, "Hey there kiddo, you remember me, don't you? Mom told me to take you home." I thought, bitch, that's the oldest trick in the book. My parents told me if this ever happened, one thing I could do was run to the nearest adult and yell mom. Mom or dad. Dad, so that's what I did. A teacher was walking into the school and I said, "Oh dad, there you are." The guy got TF out of there. I explained to the teacher why I did what I did. We didn't get his plate number sadly enough. When I was very little my dad took my sister and I on a river camping trip for a few days. We got to the little rural town at the end of the river where a buddy left our truck and trailer at the boat launch for us. My sister was old enough to sort of help dad with loading the boat, hold rope so it doesn't float away while we back up etc. But I was too little to really do much so I started wandering around looking for stuff. I found a dead bumblebee and I really loved bumblebees so I decided to bury it in a little grave to pay respects. I found a patch of flowers near the edge of the boat launch, by the woods. I'm crouched down, completely absorbed by my trying to make a little cross for a headstone out of 2 twigs and a bit of grass, when suddenly I hear my dad's deep, booming voice scream, "Hey!" He was a good 10 yards away from me but it was so loud I could feel it in my chest and I jumped and spun around towards him. He is already halfway to me, running. His face looks scary. He looks so mad, so focused, and he's looking over my shoulder instead of at me. I run over to him, no idea what's happening but scared that I'd at least get in trouble if I didn't go over to him right away. He picks me up and puts both me and my sister into the truck to finish loading by himself. Apparently a man tried to take me. I never even knew he was there. Dad caught sight of him just as he began lunging towards me and scared him off. I wouldn't have known until I was already gone if he hadn't been so aware. Watch your kids, it only takes a second. Actually the opposite here. I once fell off my bike OMW to school. Only an older man in a little white van stopped, put my bike in his car, asked where I lived and brought me home. Only recently realized that I'm really lucky to live in a safe area where I wasn't even afraid to get in an unknown man's car and tell him where I lived. When I was in 5th grade, I was finally allowed to walk home from school alone. This was a big deal to me for a couple of reasons. 1. I am not the most social person and after a full day of school I just wanted some time with no one talking to me. The library was right next to my school, so I often went from school to the library and then I would detour past a bakery as I walked home. I usually read while I walked. My father and my uncle both were big on safety rules. We lived in the only 2-story house with a fire escape ladder in the upstairs on our block. We had to practice going down it at least once a year. They drilled a ton of safety rules into me that were not common in the early 1980s. I was walking home from school with my book, reading away. A car pulled up next to me and the owner asked me for directions. I was polite enough to tell him I didn't know, but he kept following me. Then he asked if I was my name and then he told me that my father was hurt at work and my uncle sent him to come bring me to the hospital. That set off alarm bells. We had a plan in place for emergencies. No one in my family would ever send someone who was not a family member to get me. We had at least 200 relatives who would be called to pick me up before a person I did not know was sent. Big Catholic family on that side. I especially knew that my uncle would not have sent him. I was absolutely sure of this. So I ran to a house that I knew would have an adult in it. It wasn't on my block, but in our area parents who were at home usually had an ear out if a kid yelled. I did know the family who lived in the house, slightly. The guy yelled some curses at me and drove off when I started knocking on the door and yelling. I went home, called grandma to make sure no one was hurt and never said another word. I was a latchkey kid, which I loved, and I never said a word until a couple years later. Mostly I didn't say anything because I would not have been allowed to walk to the library or school alone again. I also figured I handled it. Years later when I mentioned it, my uncle knew exactly who the guy was. I described him in the car and nope. The guy was a pedophile and got fired shortly after that because he was caught with child porn at work. I'm from a pretty dangerous place, and at the time I was growing up, kidnappings were the criminal fad at the moment. Some people working close and around my family had been planning to kidnap me. Friends, some military, police or security, and families started seeing weird patterns around us, and after a short police investigation, those people planning got arrested for a short while and most are dead or in jail for other crimes. I was too young to remember, but my mom was crossing the street with me as a 1-year-old in one arm and a bag of McDonald's in another. A strange man came up to her calling me his nephew and tried to snatch me from her arms. In the middle of the street, my mom dropped the food, but by this point he started to have a grip on me. Luckily, he gave up, probably because of the attention he was beginning to draw to himself. My mom tells me there were police sitting right across the street and they just ignored her screams and the very obvious attempted kidnapping happening. So when I was 17, my crazy rich European mom forced me to sign a contract with a company in South Africa where they being my parents, would pay crazy money for me to board with and work for a conservation org. I didn't want to go, but she was convinced it would be good for me. She'd emailed back and forth with this woman for weeks if not months behind my back and been convinced by how this woman also had kids. When I arrive in South Africa, it turns out to be a scam. There is no org. The longer I stay, the weirder it gets. I'm living alone with a middle-aged man in an empty mega luxury house on a Gulf estate. They are con artists who are banned from various European countries. As I later learn, fake names and all. The wife and their 2 kids returned from holidays in Switzerland after a couple of weeks. At first they were acting friendly, but they took all my papers and documents, passport, health insurance card. They blocked my visa process, which later resulted in me being an illegal immigrant and being blacklisted from South Africa. I want to go home, but my parents don't let me come back. My mom is crazy. There was one guy in this situation who was good, and also being scammed by them, and he saved me. Let's call him Jeff. I was unaware of the gravity of the situation. I was a suicidal, depressed 17-year-old kid. A lot of crazy shit came out later. These people were meeting Jeff's wife alone and threatening her and scaring her. They were scamming left and right and being shady. One day Jeff rocks up when I am in the house by myself. He tells me to just pack a backpack quickly and get in the car. He drove me to his home where he basically just took me into his family, and he went back later to get my possessions. I later found out that he went full apeshit on these people and pulled a door off its hinges during altercations to get my papers and documents back. He involved the police because they didn't want to return my papers. Shortly after, those guys disappeared alongside all the appliances, electronics and furniture from that luxury house, which wasn't theirs. I ended up cutting my family off and living with Jeff, his wife and his kids for 2 years. I was gonna live my life there, but after 2 years my missing visa caused me to get deported. Basically, I never considered it kidnapping until I told the story to someone and they said, wow, basically you were almost kidnapped. I still don't know WTF it was, but I still remember how tense Jeff was when he told me to grab what I could and get in the car. Thank God for that man. Never go to a second location. Even if they threaten you, the chances of them killing you in the middle of the street is less likely than them killing you once they get you in the basement. The first time was when I was 10. I was hanging out with my dad and brother on the local high school's outdoor running track. My dad was running laps and my little brother was practicing kicks for his soccer team. I got bored and decided to check out the rickety pavilion nearby. It put me on a hill kind of far from the track and higher above it. I could see my dad and brother, but there was considerable distance. Suddenly some middle-aged guy just appeared behind me. My family was lower middle class, but this dude's appearance was just wrong to me. Oversized sweats, reeked of BO, wasn't running and didn't have children or anyone with him. He asked some questions and I nodded because I was looking to get far away from him. He was asking about my hobbies, if I lived nearby, etc. I remembered my mom saying normal adults don't make friends with children or ask children for help. He tried to put a hand on my shoulder and I screamed at the same time my dad did, and suddenly dad was right there and was chasing the guy to his car. Second time I was 17. I was driving home from my boyfriend's place and stopped to get gas around 10 p.m. This was when a lot of stations made you go into prepay. Ike, if they still do. I haven't driven in years. A white van pulled up on the other side of the pump. I wasn't oblivious to the danger, but figured they'd go inside too and were probably just minding their business. I was wrong. No one from the van got out. I knew something was wrong, but I was panicking BC. I had no clue what to do. I stupidly walked back to my car and saw a man standing right by my driver's side door. I made a split decision and moved fast, unlocking the passenger door, slid in as fast as I could and slammed the locks down right as the guy tried to wrench the driver's side door open. He started screaming, but I floored it. Then I had a panic attack at home. I lived in big city suburbs as a kid. There were many stranger danger scares, most of them happening when I was 12 and younger. One stuck out from the rest. I lived on a corner where, across the street, my best friends lived, and all we did was play outside from 8 a.m. till dinner, every day. However, like clockwork, my 2 doors down neighbor, he was like 60 plus, very nice, would walk his dog Emmy. Every day my friends and I, for 4-ish years straight, would run over, have a quick chat and pet Emmy. This went on for years and he never said anything out of pocket. Until one day, I was sitting outside waiting for my friends to return outside from lunch. He shows up with Emmy and we begin to chat. He asked if I wanted to walk Emmy to the elementary school with him. This elementary school is 3 doors down, but it was a crime-ridden area and my mom told me I could never go more than 2 doors down to play. Thank God I said no. So time passes. Friends aren't out yet. He returns and mentions how something is stuck in his dryer and I am the only person who can fix it since I am tiny. I try to explain how I would need my mom's permission first. He goes to grab me and immediately my friends came out. He said, "Oh, it's fine, I can get my grandson to get it," and walks off. I never really gave it any mind until 5 years later. Police are surrounding my street and he gets arrested. He has a shit ton of CP. Here is the kicker. When he got out of jail he could stay in his house because the elementary school was 100-ish feet short from what's considered a legal distance. But he couldn't walk Emmy down toward our houses anymore because it's too close to the school. But regardless, I never saw Emmy ever since the police showed up. I hope she lived the rest of her life with a much nicer owner. I was doing homework in a diner late at night my senior year of college. There were a few people in there, so it wasn't deserted. But there was one guy who was creeping me out, just watching me for what seemed like hours. I had my back to him but the diner had mirrors all around the interior so I could see him staring at me. This was before cell phones were common, and my car was parked a couple blocks away, so I felt like my only option was to wait him out. He finally left and made small talk with the waitress on his way out. I was going to ask to use the phone to call the cops to ask them to walk me to my car, but since it seemed like the waitress knew the guy, it put me at ease a little bit and I just paid. Watched the guy drive away in a black truck, and then booked it out of there. Unfortunately, the guy must have been watching for me in his rear view mirror as he drove away because about a half block away from where I was, through an intersection, he did a U-turn and started racing back my way. I knew I couldn't make it to my car or anywhere safe before he got to me. I realized my best shot at not getting kidnapped would be to jump into the middle of the street and start screaming. Miraculously, the light turned red right as he got to it and he stopped. Even more miraculously, the first vehicle to turn toward me from the cross street was a police cruiser. I flagged it down and burst into tears from adrenaline when the officer rolled down his window and asked what was wrong. I told him, as the guy peeled away from the intersection with the next light change, and he followed me as I walked back to my car. Then followed me home and sat outside my apartment building for an hour or so to make sure the guy hadn't followed us. There were a couple of stranger rapes, like stereotypical guy coming out of nowhere to assault the woman, in the next few months, and I always wondered if it was the same guy who almost got me. Believe it or not, my attempted kidnapper was my mother. I'd practically cut her out of my life as she was a horrible person with a volatile and unstable personality. When I was a child, she subjected me to a lot of violence and neglect and almost killed my brother and I on at least a couple of occasions. And when we grew up, I noticed her becoming more fatalistic about life and she developed a lot of strange ideas. My feeling was that she was entertaining some sort of idea about killing us all again. I couldn't deal with her mental health issues, so I cut her out of my life until one day, I was persuaded by my brother to give her one last chance and agree to meet up with her. I would only meet up with her on the condition that we did it in broad daylight, in public, at a well-known cafe. I hoped that being in public would moderate her behavior. I couldn't drive at the time, so I took the train to get to town. The whole time leading up she had been weirdly nice and enthusiastic, and when I arrived at the train station, she came to see me. She then suddenly started asking about the day's plans and then informed me that she needed to change her parking spot as there wasn't enough time in that car park. "Come with me," she said. "I'm only driving to a car park closer to the cafe." I felt very reluctant to get into the car with her, but in the end went for it. But as she drove, she started to miss all the right turnoffs to the town center, and when I noticed her heading out of town, I started asking to get out of the car, but she just ignored me. I did contemplate getting out of the car while it was moving, but after I realized that she was driving me back to the farm I had grown up on, I thought better of it and just tried to manage the situation. After arriving, thereon followed a bizarre situation where she paraded me around in front of certain workers and village people to show them that I did in fact exist. I felt deeply uncomfortable. The other people also looked very uncomfortable, but I didn't want to trigger her so as to not get other people involved. I'd learned as a child that generally, as long as you went with the flow of whatever current delusion she had, you could keep her pacified. The most unsettling time was later when I found myself in the house alone together. The whole day I hadn't had an opportunity to get away, but now we were in a household where she had plenty of knives etc. at her disposal. I avoided eating anything as much as I could because on previous occasions she had put rat poison in food. Eventually I managed to convince her to allow me to ring for a taxi, and when I finally got one, I was never so happy to get off that goddamn farm, and vowed never to meet up with her under any pretense again. And before you say that I am exaggerating the dangers of the situation and her mental instability, just months later that year she had a huge schizophrenic episode and violently attacked a number of people and their properties before ending up in a police cell and then getting sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So based on my personal experience, my advice is that if you ever find yourself taken hostage by someone who is clearly very mentally unwell, just do your best to play along with their delusions until you can find a moment of opportunity where you can either convince them to let you go or safely slip away.